12 wild cheetahs will be leaving South Africa for India next month. They'll be reintroduced in the country after being declared extinct there in 1952. The cats will be translocated to Kuno National Park in the central state. And the University of Pretoria has been central in attempts to reintroduce cheetahs into India's ecosystem. To find out more now, we're joined virtually from Pretoria by Professor Adrian Tordiffe, a Veterinary Wildlife Specialist at the university. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Professor. Obviously, this is a project that doesn't come together overnight. Can you give us a sense of where all of this started and how difficult it was piecing together whether or not this would be a viable project to take on?
Yeah, this has come over the last almost 2 years. It started in 2020 when, well, for the Indians, started quite a long time before that. I mean, I think even since the extinction of the species in 1952, they've made some attempts to, try and get Asiatic cheetahs from Iran. But because that population is so small at the moment, probably only 12 individuals in the wild, it really isn't possible for them to get cheetahs from that source. But certainly in terms of their approach to the South African side, they approached me in 2020 to look at the possibility of getting cheetahs from South Africa, which at this stage only has the only growing population of cheetahs anywhere in the world. In our small reserves spread across many different small, mostly privately owned, some of them government-owned reserves across South Africa. And so I spoke to individuals from the Indian Wildlife Institute and from their National Tiger Conservation Authority in 2020, and from there things moved on. But we've been planning for quite a long time. We've run into numerous difficulties. I mean, there's been some opposition to this project, and we've had to really sort of explain and defend our position and explain why we think it is really important for this project to go ahead.
Well, tell us about that, because one would think that, like you said, our population of cheetahs is growing, but they're mainly in smaller reserves where they are being taken care of, for want of a better phrase. I suppose the main question would be, can we afford to can our population of cheetahs afford to send cheetahs over to India? Because according to what I understand in this agreement, we'll send over a batch every year for the next 10 years.
Sure, and actually, what, we cannot afford to not send them at this stage. We have a population of just over 500 cheetahs in the small reserves. That excludes the populations in the Kuno National Park and Kgalagadi and the sort of national parks, bigger areas where those populations are fairly stable, but they're not necessarily growing. In the small reserves, we now are sitting with a very effective growth rate of around 8.8% of the population. And we're sitting with a surplus number of cheetahs. We've actually determined that through an actual analysis that there are about 29 surplus individuals that have to go somewhere. And we don't have any new reserves coming on board to take on cheetahs in South Africa. There are very few. And so we've actually managed to export cheetahs to Mozambique, to Malawi. Those are places in Africa where there is some stability and where there is the necessary security to be able to ensure that any individuals that we reintroduce there are safe. But there are not many places in Africa for that where that is the case. And so India at this stage presents us with an opportunity to expand the population, or the range at least of these cheetahs. They currently only occupy about 9% of their original historical range. And, with a declining population everywhere else, in every single other population in the world is declining other than this particular population. So if we don't actually create more space for cheetahs and expand the population, then we will have to start putting some of our cheetahs in our current small reserves on contraceptives. And that would be a tragedy, when you're dealing with a vulnerable species that, potentially could go extinct in the next 50 years.
You've mentioned space. Let's talk about space. What kind of space does an animal like the cheetah need? I mean, I'm a layperson, but I think they are of the most magical creatures out there just by the way they move. But I would think that they need space. What have we learned from the first iteration of this project? Because I believe Namibia sent over a batch late last year. Have we learned anything from that experience that went into this batch and this project of yours? And does India, like I say, have the space for them? Because we do know that in India, India, we hear reports year on year about the encroachment of the space on their natural populations in India because of their booming population.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, India has a population of 1.2 billion people, and you need space for the people as well as the animals. They have a fairly different system to what we are used to here in South Africa, in that there aren't any fences in their protected areas. But they've done an absolutely fantastic job with their tiger population as well as with leopards, which occur across India in actually fairly high densities. And these animals move in between humans and coexist with humans in quite a phenomenal way. It doesn't mean that there's no conflict. There certainly is conflict, and the Indians deal with that in a very effective way, in that they provide compensation for people that incur any losses, whether it be human life losses or whether it be animal losses. The cheetah is quite an interesting animal, in that it is very unlikely that cheetahs will actually, I mean, we don't know, with a very, very few cases of cheetahs actually attacking humans. So in that sense, they are actually a lot easier to deal with than tigers and leopards that you would have in India. And there's a real move by the Indian government to create new space. Kuno National Park, for example, was occupied by a number of very poor rural villages. And people have actually been incentivized quite well through financial incentives to move out of that area and to create the space, these sort of landscapes right in the middle of human sort of occupation, but more than 700 square kilometers of space in Kuno, and it's by certainly not the only place in which we would, there are many, many other areas in probably about 700,000 square kilometers in which cheetahs can potentially move into in India.
And what have you heard? How is that first batch of cheetahs that went over from Namibia last year? How are they doing over there at the moment?
Well, they're doing remarkably well. I mean, some of those individuals actually, not all of them are totally wild, in that some of them have spent substantial periods of time in captivity in some of the sanctuaries in Namibia. Others are completely wild. Just, from the South African part, all of the cheetahs that are going from South Africa are completely wild. They've never spent a day in captivity other than the period of time that they've now been in quarantine. But some of these cheetahs actually had been fed in captivity for quite long periods of time, and they adapted to hunting on their own very, very quickly. I mean, so they would be hunting spotted deer, what we call cheetah or axis deer, in India, and actually is quite a relatively abundant prey species, and actually is a lot easier to catch than things like impala or springbok. So they've managed to start hunting again on their own very, very quickly. We've got one situation with one particular individual at the moment that may have some kidney issues. One of the Namibian cheetahs that's not doing particularly well. But I don't think that has anything related to the actual translocation or the fact that it's in India. If it had stayed in Namibia, it would have probably developed the same problems.
It's also not a short domestic flight that these wild animals are going on. That must be quite an operation in itself, getting these wild animals and transporting them all the way from South Africa all the way to India. How big of a logistical project is that?
It is indeed, and it is a real great risk, especially when you're working with captive zoo animals, you really have very little risks. But cheetahs are a species that are incredibly sensitive to stress-induced problems when you are immobilizing them, anesthetizing them, and translocating them. And we can actually see mortalities. But we've been working very hard on solving some of those issues, and we've got some really nice tranquilizers that we are using on them at the moment that really reduce the stress during the translocation period, and have proven, certainly we use them now, we've only probably been using this for about a year or so, but in the last translocation of the Namibian cheetahs to India, we tested this particular drug tranquilizer out, and it proved to be absolutely a lifesaver. So all 8 survived. All 8 did very, very well after their initial introduction. So we're really confident with the actual protocol that we've developed for the translocation in keeping these animals calm, sedated, and preventing any real damage to their, mortalities, if you like, during the translocation, which have traditionally been very, very high.
One last question before I let you go. It was a certain type of cheetah that was extinct in India. So the cheetahs that we're sending over aren't exactly the same kind. I mean, I'll leave that to scientists such as yourself to explain in layman's terms. But what kind of impact, or firstly, when you remove an animal like that from a natural space, an animal like that gets extinct, what kind of impact does it have on the space that they took up? And now that you reintroduce them, what kind of impact could it have on the space? And how important then, of course, to that space is it for that animal to be reintroduced into a space that they were many, many years ago?
It's absolutely critically important. Carnivores play such a critical role in the ecosystem in which they the function that they have in an ecosystem. And just to say that the difference between an Asiatic cheetah and a Southern African cheetah is so small that the ecological role, the kind of prey that they would prey on would not differ. It's not going to differ because of the small genetic differences between those two subspecies. But if we look at an example really of, say, for instance, the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in North America, I mean, it had dramatic effects on the landscape. It had an effect on the deer behavior. It had an effect on the vegetation because where those deer were feeding. It then eventually had an effect on the water systems and the way in which that functions. So it's a top-down effect that we see when predators play a role. Now you'd say, well, we've got leopards. Why would we need extra cheetahs in India? But they play different ecological roles because the leopards mainly hunt at night. The cheetahs are hunting primarily during the day. So they're changing the behavior of the prey species. And those prey species are obviously having an effect on the vegetation landscape because they're feeding on different areas. And so as soon as you introduce a leopard, a cheetah into India, it has a dramatic effect. The other thing is that the hunting styles of these two animals differ. The cheetahs tend to go for the weaker animals because they chase animals, and the ones that lag behind will obviously get caught first. Whereas leopards are ambush predators, so they often will take the first one, the one that's in front of the group, and they don't really mind whether it's the weak one or the strong one. So your cheetah plays a really important role in selecting and removing the weaker animals from the group, whereas the leopards will just take any animal. And so they have an important evolutionary role in changing and driving evolution and the development of the actual prey species that they're hunting. So these are the reasons why we really feel it is important to add an additional predator into the mix and the unique role that the cheetah potentially could play in India.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed on that project, and do keep us updated. Still to come, that is, Professor Adrian Tordiffe, a Veterinary Wildlife Specialist connected to University of Pretoria, speaking to us from Pretoria there. We thank him for his time and his insight. It really was an education. Still to come.